Hello storytellers, welcome to Bound by Words. My name is Madie. If we haven't met yet, I am a freelance editor and fantasy writer, and today we are going to be talking about whether you should write your book in present or past tense. We're going to be looking at some pros and cons of each of the tenses, some places that, they lend themselves really well, and some places that they might have some resistance. I'll also be sharing some really popular books with each tense, specifically YA fantasy books, since I feel like that is the genre I probably read the most. Fantasy, at least, is a genre that I gravitate towards the most. But before we dive into that, it is important to know that neither tense is wrong. Some of them just have different strengths and highlights that might lend better to your natural writing abilities, and some might have strengths or limits that will actually lend better to your storytelling abilities or the specific storytelling elements you have in your current work in progress. For a lot of people, tense can be kind of willy-nilly. Maybe you sit down and the first time you go to write that novel, you start writing in past tense and it feels really natural, and that's what you do. No questions asked, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think for the most part, a lot of newer writers, they tend to have some tense inconsistencies. I actually think most writers will, occasionally have those tense inconsistencies where, your book is in past tense, but you accidentally slip into present for a little while. But I feel like the newer you are, while you're still discovering your author voice and what is most natural and, how to tell a good story, those inconsistencies can be more severe or more frequent. And that's usually the part where authors go, well, which one is right or which one should I choose? And there is no right or wrong, but we're going to go over what the difference is and how it might help your book so that you can make an educated, guess at which one might be best. And you can always change your mind. It might involve a lot of editing, but it is doable. And the more you find your author voice, the more you'll understand which one you like better or which one you'll need to select for certain types of stories. And if you think about it, a lot of readers actually aren't going to notice what tense your book is in. They're going to notice more about, are your characters interesting? Is your plot really gripping? Do they like the story? And tense will help you tell a better story. But I don't ever hear readers pick up a book and say, it was in present tense and I hate that, so I'm going to put it down. I'm sure those people exist. It's just not something we hear talked about very often. So this is purely, a writer's storytelling tool kind of technical topic. Now, jumping right into the pros of present tense, we're going to start with the pros and cons of present tense, then the pros and cons of past tense, and then we're going to be sharing those common popular books that, we hear talked about a whole lot at the end and what tense they're in. So we're going to start with the pros and then the cons of present tense. So one of the biggest pros for writing in present tense that you'll see almost everywhere, everywhere that I was researching, this was the number one thing people commented on, is it creates a sense of immediacy. Which means your readers are right there, they're experiencing it, and it makes it firsthand. Past tense doesn't prevent this from happening, but present tense does it without any effort. If you're writing in present tense, we are there with the characters. We don't really have a choice. So if your story is very live in the moment, or the way that you look at or view your main character and the way you want to talk about them is all about what is happening now, what am I thinking about, what am I doing, and how am I experiencing the present moment, then present tense might be the way to go for you. The second pro of present tense is it gives us a direct window into our characters' thoughts and their stream of consciousness. So think internal dialogue, the voice inside your head. We get to see that with the present tense. So think about, thrillers where you're really living in the moment and all you know is what that person is experiencing right now. This also lends really well to dystopian stories where, you're going through that post-apocalyptic or that sci-fi related world that is so severely different than our world. It'll help you experience things in a non-overwhelming way for your readers because you can only experience what your character is thinking and, working over in their head right in that moment. And that can create a really close emotional tie between your reader and your protagonist because everything that we will experience reading your story, we're going to experience it through the filter of the protagonist's viewpoint. If, they're an overly negative person, then they're going to have that slightly negative, skeptical, a little bit suspicious spin on everything, and that's what we're going to feel and connect to as the reader. I know I use negativity as the example there, but it could work for somebody who's overly positive as well. I think present tense lends very well to morally gray characters because even though we don't really have the option to leave information out because we're experiencing the story right there with the character at the time they are, we do have the option to only give a part of the information. Everyone has things in their past or things that they happen that they highlight, and they have things that they sort of shove under the rug, and that's something you can take advantage of when you're writing in present tense. One last pro of writing in present tense is that it's considered the simpler tense. There is a lot less going on when it comes to like the actual syntax and grammar of writing in present tense, because if you're writing in past tense, you know you're going to include some past and some present, and it's going to be a little bit of a mix. But when you're writing in present tense, you have a lot less verb tenses to worry about, which means you're going to have a lot less subject-verb agreement to worry about. So some people like it just because it's almost an easier tense to write in. One of the biggest cons for writing in present tense is that it restricts your ability to move through time. And I know what you're thinking. You think, well, a story happens in consecutive order, so that's not something that we do often anyway. But it actually can be. You can't go over, how something happened in the past, even just last night or a week ago, if you're in the present tense, unless your character is thinking about that. Which means you have a lot less time to include things that happened in the past or things that will happen in the future. You could lean on flashbacks for that information, but those aren't always favorable anymore. They have to be done really well. So in general, you're just going to have a lot less time and space and ability to, backtrack or juggle around timelines in any capacity. The second con in writing in present tense is that it can be a little bit harder to make a complex character. Now the reason is because we're experiencing things with the character. We're going to form our opinion of them based on exactly how they're handling things in the moment, which means we don't have any of that extra information about how other people see them, how their actions might appear to those around them, and we're getting less of that history, like how I just mentioned, you don't have space to jump around in time. Because we're getting less of that personal history from that character, it's a little bit harder to make a complex character. Now you'll see when we get to the end and we go over, popular books that are in present tense, that there is a surefire way to make a strong, complex character that your readers will relate to. It's just a little bit harder in present tense than it is in past. And the third and the last con of writing in present tense is that trivial events can be easier to sneak into your novel. I like to call it fluff material, that material that we don't necessarily care about, the day-to-day, it's why eating and sleeping and stuff like that aren't usually in novels, because we know what sleeping's like. We don't want several page account of them sleeping. So as a writer, especially as a newer writer, or even novice and intermediate writers, unless you're the best of the best, it can be really easy to accidentally sneak trivial and boring information, to be blunt, into a present tense novel if you're not careful. Now these are always things that you can edit out. Your first draft's not going to be perfect. It's going to have a lot of extra material. I personally am an overwriter, so this is something that doesn't scare me away from the tense, because I already know I'm going to have a lot of trivial things that are going to need to be cut out, so might as well, pick whatever tense that I want. But if that's something that you're definitely trying to steer clear of, maybe you're an underwriter, or maybe the idea of cutting all of that out at the end is really daunting, then keep that in mind as you're writing in present tense, or as you're choosing a tense in general. The reason these things tend to slip more into present tense is because we're experiencing that day alongside of our character, so whenever the next thing happens to the character, we're more than likely to write about it, even if it's something that's not exciting. So we're going to move on to past tense now, and we're going to talk about some pros and cons of past tense, and then we're going to move on to those popular books and what tenses they're in. So pros of past tense, and the first one is that it is considered the traditional tense, and it is vastly more common. Now there are countless, really innumerable number of novels that are written in present tense. It's not that they don't exist, it's that past tense is the default for a lot of people, and it is more common. And I think this is because, traditionally whenever publishing was growing up as an industry and it was, this little baby thing, I think most, if not all, books were past tense then. Most fall novels, I should say, not all books. But it's just really common for novels to have been written in the past tense, but now we're delving into a lot more creativity when it comes to writing, because we're trying to be original and share stories in new, more interesting, and more complex ways. The second pro for past tense is that it allows you to jump around in time. So we talked about this with present tense, how it sort of prevents you a little bit from doing that. Past tense gives you almost free reign of a timeline. You're talking about something that happened entirely in the past. The narrator, no matter who they are, is in the future and they are recounting something. So you could recount something in consecutive order, and you can recount, the first 2 months and then go back and say something that happened the day one, or you can recount the very last day of your story and then go back and tell it again from the beginning. One of the reasons that this is really awesome is because it lends really well to multiple point of view stories. If you're writing in the past tense in a multiple point of view story, then you can recount what happened to character A through days 1 through 5, and then you can recount what happened to character B on days 1 through 5. Or it can be character A days 1 through 5, character B days 4 through 7. You can have that little bit of overlap because you are able to jump and talk about different timelines because it's all in the past. Now, I wouldn't abuse this too much. We don't want our readers to be, motion sick going through our book, stressed out or confused. It's actually something that I had problems with whenever I was watching the Witcher series, which is relatively new, and I know that the books are really highly rated, and I know the games are really well done, and I hear a lot of people say amazing things about the show, and I should probably go back and watch it again, but when I sat down to watch it the first time, I didn't know that I was going to be jumping timelines the whole series, so that was really confusing for me. So you don't want to overwhelm readers if you choose past tense because you want to do that jumping around, but you do have more flexibility when it comes to including information from different areas in time. Speaking of including different information, pro number 3 of writing in past tense is that you can include more information. With the present tense, you're experiencing things right as the character is, so you don't have the ability to really create suspense by having information that some people know and other people don't, which I think is a great storytelling method for creating suspense, is having one character or even just the reader know some information that's going to change a character's life and the character themselves doesn't know about it yet. We're waiting to see how are they going to react to that. We're waiting to see, what they're going to do moving forward with that information, and we really only have that flexibility in past tense. Just like the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20, so in hindsight we have a better scope of vision when it comes to information, and that better scope of vision can, lend itself really well to a bunch of different storytelling methods, not just tension, but I think that's a great one. If done well, it can actually help with the pacing of the story, but we're actually going to talk more about the pacing of stories and the cons of past tense, which I guess is maybe the first con we should talk about. So the first con of past tense is that it can be easy to slow your story's pacing down by focusing too much on reflection and analyzing and also recapping. If something happens to a group of characters and they reconvene with another group of characters, then you might have the feel in your heart that you need to show that kind of recap there between them, and you really don't. That's going to slow your story down a lot, especially when it comes to the reflection, like why did this happen? How did it happen? What do we do now? We don't really want to waste time in those high stakes moments with a lot of reflection. You're going to want to have reflection sometimes, but you're not going to want to slow your story down for it. But it's not that past tense is slower than present tense, because present tense, you can actually accidentally slow your story down with the reflection and, the internal monologue and thinking about why something is happening or how things are the way that they are. So each tense here has their own con when it comes to ways that your story could be slowed down. So that's something that you want to pick based on, your specific writing style and also what story you're trying to tell. The second con of writing in past tense is that it's easier to slip into telling, into that age-old argument of show versus tell. You should definitely show and tell. There is a place for both, but whenever you are experiencing a story, you want to be primarily showing. You want the reader to experience the thing and make their own judgment and feel really connected to it whenever you're writing a story in past tense, because you are in the present recounting something that already happened. It can be really easy to use a lot of telling language and to over-explain some things instead of writing in an immersive way that really shows what's happening. Of course, just like we've said with almost every con now, it's not that you can't, show, it's just that it's easier to slip into telling. And it's not that authors haven't done that extremely well, the telling, it's just that it's a little bit easier. So it's something you have to judge for your own voice and your own experience and your own story. And the last con for writing in past tense is that it might be a little harder to connect to your readers. Now, harder than what? It's definitely not impossible to connect to readers in any tense, but it'll be a little bit harder than present tense. This doesn't mean that it's going to be difficult. It doesn't mean that you're going to be racking your brain over it, but when you're comparing the two tenses side by side, it is easier to connect with your readers in present tense because we have that access to their thoughts and their stream of consciousness. It's not so easy with past tense, but it can be done. You just have to create more opportunities to see who the character is, why they're making decisions the way they are, and you have to find more opportunities to include, their thought process behind things. We want to be rooting for them, and it's easy in present tense whenever everything we experience is through the filter of the main character, and it's just a tiny bit more difficult in past tense where everything we experience is through the filter of the narrator and not necessarily the protagonist. Sometimes they're the same person, sometimes they're not. And now for the end part that I know a lot of you guys are waiting for, which popular books were written in each tense. Got my notepad out because I don't want to lie to you. I'm going to share the title of the book and also the Goodreads rating. Now, none of these are like, overall 5-star books. I'm pretty sure that's pretty impossible. On Goodreads in general, if a book is 4 stars or higher, it's generally a pretty well-written book. All of the books that I've seen that are like really highly talked about and that I've really enjoyed personally, they're all above 4 stars. That's just something I sort of keep in the back of my head whenever I'm shopping for books, to add to my TBR, is that if it has 4 stars or more on Goodreads, I'm probably gonna enjoy it. Even if it's not my favorite story, it's gonna be something I'm not gonna regret reading. So since we started with present tense and went on to past, we're gonna do the present tense books first. The first one is The Hunger Games. And I think I said earlier, I think this is really common with like dystopian or really sci-fi like stories. The Hunger Games, the first book had a 4.32 rating and the second book had a 4.3 rating. It's also just a really famous story. If you haven't read the books, you probably have read the movie. That book series was written in present tense, as well as Divergent, which I threw in there because they're almost in the same category. But the Divergent book, the first one had a 4.27 rating, and the second one had a 3.99 rating, which is still pretty impressive, even though it's not over 4 stars. It's really close. But those are two different really famous stories that were turned into movies and became huge franchises that are in present tense. The third one is An Ember in the Ashes, and I loved the Ember in the Ashes series. It's one of my favorite series that I've ever read. It's very highly talked about on social media, Instagram and Book Talk. The first book has a 4.26 and the second book has a 4.25 average rating on Goodreads. As of today, that's gonna change a little bit here and there, but An Ember in the Ashes was written in present tense. The fourth book I have written down is The Cruel Prince, another really famous story by an incredibly famous author, Holly Black. I love almost all of her work. I actually grew up reading the Spiderwick Chronicles, and I didn't realize that was written by her until I was reading The Cruel Prince, and I was on her Goodreads page, and that blew me away. So she started writing children's books when I was a child, and is now writing young adult and adult books now that I'm an adult, and I love that. But The Cruel Prince has a 4.09 rating for the first book and a 4.39 rating for the second book as of today. I think the 4.09 I was really surprised about because I know that's a very highly talked about series, but as the series go on, the ratings go higher. So now we're going to move over to some books that were written in the past tense. The first book I have written down is ACOTAR, A Court of Thorns and Roses. Has very impressive Goodreads ratings. Nobody's surprised by that, but it was written in the past tense. The first book for ACOTAR has a 4.19 rating, but the second book has a 4.62 rating because of that amazing plot twist that we all love, and the third book has a 4.45 rating. Those are all incredibly impressive ratings, and she's actually decided to continue with the series years later because of that, but ACOTAR, one of the most talked about series, is in past tense. The next one is Kingdom of the Wicked. Now, Kingdom of the Wicked has a 3.96 rating on Goodreads, but the second one, Kingdom of the Cursed, has a 4.24 rating. I loved both books. Carrie Maniscalco is amazing. She's the author of Stalking Jack the Ripper. Those books are written in past tense, the Kingdom of the Wicked ones. I didn't check Stalking Jack the Ripper, but I'll probably do that right after we finish this video. And the last one I have for books that are written in past tense is Caraval. The Caraval series by Stephanie Garber. The first book has a 4 rating, 4 even, and the second book has a 4.23 rating. All incredible ratings, all incredible books and authors. You probably recognize some, if not all of those names. So whether you pick past or present tense isn't going to make it or break it. It's not necessarily a marketing decision. It's a decision you need to make based on your writing style, the story you want to tell, and what plays best to your strengths as an author and a storyteller. So make sure you comment down below if the last book you read and loved was in past or present tense. And if you learned anything interesting from this video or just had a good time, make sure you give it a thumbs up. I will see you guys next time.